So first, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. The purpose of today's call is to do a little bit of a panel discussion on Rising Stars. I have Roger Kiefer and Rick Lochner with us today. Both of them have done multiple projects with Rising Stars. So the agenda for the day is I'm going to ask each of them to share, maybe a 10-minute summary of a case study of how they work with Rising Stars. And then what we'll do is open it up for questions. So, Rick, you want to go ahead and share a little bit about what you do with Rising Stars?
Sure. So the Rising Stars program I do it through the local school district, and began probably 6 years ago when they came to me and said, because I was already running a leadership institute through our local Chamber of Commerce, and a couple of the participants that happened to include, or in that program, that happened to include the public relations director for the local school district, came to me and said, hey, can we do something like this for the kids? And so we basically, in a month, pulled together the Rising Stars program, adapted it to the school year schedule that time would allow, and was able to pull it together fairly quick, and we've now run it for 5 years. The thing that made it work was the fact that we were playing off of a recent local survey that asked the business community what skill gaps they saw in the workforce that were coming out of high school and or college. And they identified, obviously, the things that are fairly consistent with the national survey results: teamwork, effective communications, collaboration, those kinds of things. And of course, those are all things that Rising Stars addresses directly. Why that's important is that the survey results made it very easy to go to the business community and get them to sponsor the kids. So essentially, it was a collaboration between the chamber, who rallied the business community, the school district. So we just basically funneled the sponsorship funds through the school education foundation. And of course, they win because the school district, like most school districts that you'll talk to, or at least good ones, usually have a strategic goal where they need to align with the business community. And so they were able to check that box. And so the funds the sponsorship funds came from the business community, filtered through the education foundation, and made its way to me, who then delivered the Rising Stars program. Again, it was just pretty much modified to fit the school year. When we first did it, we came up with 5 sessions that were done on Fridays that were institution days where the students weren't in school. Last 2 years, we've modified it to essentially span across 9 sessions done on what they call late start Wednesdays. So basically, school starts at 9 o'clock on Wednesdays, so we ran from 7 to 8:30 on selected Wednesday mornings. So that allowed us to spread it out a little bit more, do more of a spaced repetition kind of program. And then, of course, at graduation, we invited all the sponsors, all the parents, pretty much everybody who had a hand in making it a success each year, brought them all in and had a graduation ceremony. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully that'll generate a few questions.
Thanks, Rick. Roger, you want to give us an overview of your case study and how you work with Rising Stars?
Sure. We started Rising Stars at the local high school where I was living. I think it was 7 years ago, 2012. And it was, I approached the superintendent of the school who I knew pretty well, and just presented the idea of leadership development at the high school level She showed a lot of interest right away, but it was probably, I don't know, 4, maybe 6 months till I heard back from her. But at that point, she was ready to move, and we worked primarily through the dean of students and the person in charge of social work at the high school. They had an organization for young men, young African American men who actually were kind of struggling with school, and they were trying to instill leadership principles with these guys, and they were all in that program voluntarily, which really helped. I think one of the keys to Rising Stars working is that they can't be forced into the program. They need to be interested in doing it, and these guys all were. Before we launched, they asked me to do kind of an overview of it. There were 2 different groups, about 40 guys in each group, and I made a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation of what the program would be like to each of those groups. And at the end of the session, they said, so how many of you guys would be interested in participating in this? And in both cases, everybody stood up and said they'd be interested. So then they kind of knew that they would have an audience for it. And that's when we went to work on putting a schedule together. And like Rick, we had to kind of align it with the school schedule. So what we did was we just sat down in a room and came up with times that I was available, because at the time I was actually still working full-time and doing the consulting on the side. And so times that I was available and could come to the high school, and they felt like that was a class period time when they could bring all of those guys together. They actually picked 12 out of the 40 in each group to actually participate. And they were all juniors and seniors that participated. So they knew their schedules and they knew how to align it. So we just picked, I think it was 9 or 10 sessions throughout the semester, usually about 2 weeks apart. And then I would come to the high school and make and go through. We did that for 3 semesters, 12 students per semester, and like Rick, we had a graduation at the end. They made a really big deal of it. The community really embraced it. There was a lot of publicity. It's a fairly small community, Zion-Benton Township up in northern Illinois, and the community got involved. It got a lot of press locally. So it continued for 3 semesters. We ended up having 36 graduates. All of them had a great story to tell. And then I moved. I moved to Tennessee, and they wanted to keep it going. So the 3rd semester that I did it, I took 3 guys from the high school and did what I think Rising Stars calls train the trainer. And they went through the program with me. They were all young men, officials in the high school, and were actually sponsors of this group that they were choosing the students from. And so we did the train the trainer, and now I think they're in their 7th year. They just completed their 7th year of every semester, and they moved it from 12 to 18. I actually advised against that, but they did it anyhow. So they're anywhere from 16 to 18 students per semester for the last 5 years since I left. And so I think they're well over like 200 graduates now, and still going strong as far as I know. Every semester I kind of wait and see whether they're going to ask for the curriculum again. And so far, every semester they have. I get in contact with them every once in a while, make sure everything's going well. They contact me if they have a question or just need an extra resource. And whenever I'm up in that area, if I happen to be there on a day that they're presenting, I usually will sit in on the session. So it's been a great experience.
Thank you. This session is going to be very interactive because as you read the agenda or the topic, it said panel of experts. So now that Rick and Roger shared a little bit about their work with Rising Stars, we're going to open it up to questions. So this is where we need audience participation. So what questions do you have for Rick or Roger?
This is Dan Elliott. I've got, I guess, a question, either or both. I'll direct this to. It always seems that initially everyone's interested in the concept, but it always gets down to the funding as being the big hurdle. When you say you went to the local business community, can you talk just a little bit more about that as to where the funding was coming
Sure.
from, how you got people engaged?
Sure, because you're absolutely right. I always liken school districts to Congress. They'll vote yes and then no, then stall the funding. So they always love a good idea because it's all for the kids, and they see the value in it. But they're at the end of the day, they're still working within a budget. And quite frankly, that was exactly why we leveraged the results, because then I could go back to the business community, the results of the survey. I went back to the business community through the chamber and through my relationships there and said, okay, you said that there's a problem. We've identified a solution to the problem. Put your money where your mouth is. Right? Stop bitching and moaning about how, we've got these kids coming out of school that don't have these skills. Now that we have a solution, albeit a trimmed down solution in the sense that, not every student in the two high schools are going to come out with this skill, but at least we've got the ones that raise their hand and say, hey, I'll voluntarily give up, 15, 20 hours of my time, which is precious for a high school sophomore or high school junior, to raise their hand and voluntarily go through a program like this, especially ones that start at 7 o'clock in the morning. So that was really the message was, and at, $500 a student, it wasn't going to break the bank. And so we had some businesses that, funded multiple students, and we had a couple of Rotaries that stepped in and funded a couple of students. And so, that was the message that resonated.
So essentially, it was a
Does that help?
collaboration then of many businesses and organizations, just kind of a conglomeration.
Well, it absolutely is, but essentially for anything that involves a collaboration between the business community and the education system, that's the only way it's going to work. At least that I've seen. I mean, it truly is going to impact, because it impacts the community. You want to get the community involved, and fortunately, I was able to leverage the Chamber of Commerce to get the message. So, Rick Lochner is not running around pounding the street, knocking on doors. And I got the president of the Chamber of Commerce, the local Chamber of Commerce, using her platform to be able to put the word out about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and to get this collaboration going. Again, the flip side is that I saw the strategic plan for the school district, and much like Roger, I was working with the assistant superintendent of schools, who showed me their strategic plan, and one of their strategic goals was better collaborate with the business community. So to my way of thinking, I'm checking off 4 different boxes where everybody wins.
Great.
Roger, would you like to add anything about funding for your project?
Yeah, funding was never a problem for mine. I was anticipating that it would be as we were building up to the start, but it never came up as a subject. And so the school district had already figured out how to fund it. In questioning the superintendent, even though she wasn't completely forthcoming, my understanding is that they funded it primarily through a Title I grant, which they were eligible for. Any extra, I think, was funded by the school board itself through the local budget. But I think the majority of it has been funded by Title I.
Thank you. So what other questions? Lauren, Mike, anybody?
Yes, hi, it's Lauren. You both mentioned this this program extending for 9 sessions. Can you be a little bit more specific? You said they were a week or so apart, and they're an hour and a half in length. And what was the follow-up?
Can I ask, what do you mean by follow-up?
were there opportunities to speak with the individuals who participated at a later time to check in on their progress?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
In my case, yeah, we followed the curriculum, the Rising Stars materials pretty closely. I can't remember exactly how many sessions they divided into, but it's not difficult to make it fit however many sessions you have. Yeah, I gave them a lot of work to do in between the sessions and made myself available to them. And so they, I would say, fairly often, usually at least one or two would contact me in between sessions to ask a question, almost always by email. But it's 7 years later, and I still hear from some of those guys that were, especially the ones from that first session. So it is sort of a lifelong relationship, at least in some cases, if they're really interested and into it and trying to apply those principles to their lives. So I don't think there's been any. Well, I'll take that back. There was some intentional follow-up on my part after it was over. I actually scheduled a little reunion a few years later for those first three groups and went back to Illinois and met with them. Part of it was my own personal agenda because I was trying to get some footage for my website to put it on, and it's actually there. It turned out really great. And I make a little bit of an effort to try to keep up with some of those guys, but some of them have kept up with me as well. But I think to answer your question, yes, just make yourself available to them. And I really gave a lot of suggestions of things they could do in terms of exercises between sessions. So there was always something for them to talk about if they wanted to.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with Roger. I mean, the nice thing about Rising Stars, like any of the trusted advisors processes, is they're easily adaptable to a timeline that you need. Of course, with Rising Stars, you know, we pretty much have to stick to a timeline that is both fits with the time available, but also isn't, you know, you got to watch things like not scheduling it too close to homecoming, not too close to finals, you know, things of that nature. And so our program ran from early October to early March, and you know, began with an open house in September, and we officially started the program in early October and extended it. Graduation was usually early March, and so like Roger, I gave them, you know, field work to do and that sort of thing. What we did was, to heighten the interaction, was we set up if you're familiar with the application called GroupMe. You know, we would set up every single student, and my classes were usually 18 to 20 in a class that they all applied for. And so we would put everybody into this GroupMe, which is a group texting platform, and allowed me to text everybody as a group and allowed me to communicate with everybody individually. And the way I set up the field work, specifically the action plan, is that as they completed the surveys and the action plan, they would have to text me or email me, you know, one takeaway from the action plan. So it was a combination of what we did in the classroom as a group, but then I had an opportunity with each part of the action plan to then have a one-on-one conversation, because clearly they would send me, well, here's my takeaway. You know, I don't spend enough time with my family, you know, which is a fairly common one that they identified. And so naturally I would come back with a question that said, well, why do you suppose that is? And then we get into, you know, a back and a forth individual conversation, which allowed us to really dig into the context, and, you know, me in some small way help them dig a little deeper than just the topical sentence. I've also had, now post-graduation, you know, you're not going to be able to keep up with everybody, especially as they move off to college. But I have been able to stay in touch with those that have chosen to connect with me on LinkedIn. I've written letters of recommendation for several to colleges, including one to my alma mater at West Point. So,
Oh, wow.
so we have, so we do have those opportunities to stay in touch. I also attended a recognition ceremony for one of the kids who actually, as a result of the service project that I make them all do as part of a group, he actually took the service project idea, extended it, created a local chapter of this nonprofit in the high school, and that program that he created and ran helped him get into Vanderbilt.
Oh my gosh.
Things like that, there are plenty of success stories. Like I said, you're not going to be able to keep up with the 120 or so that have graduated through the program, but there's plenty of interactions for those, like Roger said, those that choose to stay in touch with you. Now I know how teachers feel, right? Every once in a while, a student comes back and said, "Hey, you had this great impact on me," but you never know when or where that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Thank you.
So next question. I actually do have a question. This is Wendy. And this is for both Rick and Roger. As you're facilitating youth, what are the differences between facilitating youth and when you're facilitating adults? Are there any key tips or techniques that are helpful for us to know about?
Well,
Roger, you want to take that one first?
one of the things I said pretty often is there's no difference in terms of what the principles that I'm trying to introduce to you as young people than I would if I were doing executive coaching with the CEO of a company. These are the exact same principles. I think that helped them understand that that this wasn't kid stuff, that this were things that would actually help them in their career, in their adult life, and so I would say from that standpoint, in terms of the content, I tried not to make it a lot different than it would have been for anyone else. The reality is that I think one of the things that I would say immediately to the difference is that repetition is even more important for them. And so we went back over, we came up with what we called mantras, and actually have them on PowerPoints now, so we could list them, and the guys, I think they're still using them. So the principles that we learned, we put into a mantra that they could kind of repeat to themselves over and over again. Things that were interesting. Some of them are famous quotes like, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, that kind of thing. So just some famous quotes that really could stick with them, but were very central to the core of what we were trying to learn or trying to convey to them. And so I think we ended up having about 18 of those, and we went over them every single session. Okay, and I would leave blanks, and that way they would have to repeat, what the word is that I was missing in the mantra, so that they would kind of learn them better. And by the end, I think they knew every single mantra that we had gone over for that. So that's an example of any form of repetition where you come back and review. That would be the one thing that would jump to my mind that would be different than you would maybe for a professional person.
Yeah, I find that with the students, at least when 5 years ago when I did my first session, was that we got to make this way more interactive than we normally might, especially since these kids are coming in on their day off, and then of course the last 2 years when they were coming in on their free time at 7 o'clock in the morning. So if you don't make it interactive, you don't get them up and walking around and moving around and that sort of thing, then you're going to lose them pretty quick. And so, and the feedback suggested that was right thinking, in the sense that just making it as interactive and experiential as possible. So things like the blindfold leadership exercise, the balloon exercise relative to time management. But, interestingly enough, what I found is that as adults, as our world becomes more experiential in and by itself, I found myself taking the Rising Stars exercises and using them with my adult clients more often than the other way around. And so, because I coach a lot of millennials in my practice, and so when you look at, kids that are 15 and 16, and then look at adults that are not more than 10, 11 years older than that, I found that with great success, a lot of the experiential things that I did with Rising Stars, I just brought into my adult coaching process, and was very well received. So almost counterintuitive the way we might have thought of it, but it worked.
Other
Hi,
questions?
Wendy, it's Lauren. I wanted to ask Rick. I have something potentially to help to co-facilitate a staff retreat for a group of people that range in age from 20 to 60, and I'm looking at the exercises. I want to make sure it's interactive because their last staff retreat was not, and I'm looking for things in your memory were the exercises that really worked best, that really were impactful. Could you tell me 3 of them?
Well, I mentioned 2 of them. If you know the exercises that I'm talking about, the balloon exercise relative to time management. Yeah, the balloon exercise for time management. That's a pretty straightforward one because I don't care how old or young you are. Most people are struggling with time management. The blindfold leadership exercise is all about communications. So that's a great one for your mixed audience, especially if you kind of force the issue and let have maybe a couple of groups where the 60-year-olds are blindfolded and have a couple of groups where the millennials are blindfolded, and you're gonna get possibly a different exercise. So, for instance, one of my at graduation, all the high school students would stand up and talk about something that they took away from the program, and I remember one student stood up and sheepishly said, the impact of communication, because he was the leader in the blindfold exercise, and I just happened to overhear him say, it's on the white square. So, that really stuck with him. And then he laughed and he said, he caught himself using the wrong words for the situation. So why would you use colors for somebody who's blindfolded? So, and it stuck with him all the way to graduation because he brought it up.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Since there are no other questions, before we end the call, I'm not going to keep you on the call unnecessarily long, but if Rick and Roger could each share with us, if there's something that you think an affiliate, is there that 1 or 2 things that you think an affiliate, it's important for them to know if they're talking to folks about Rising Stars or facilitating Rising Stars, what would that be? Or what would they be?
Well, I would give 2. One has to do with the front end, and that is kind of what we already talked about with respect to how do you get it funded, how do you get it up off the ground, because that's going to be the primary obstacle to getting it off the ground. It just, in more cases than not, they either don't know about grants, or even if they did, they have other priorities. But getting the business community involved and make it a collaborative effort, I think is the absolute right way to go about it, with or without funding being an issue. I just think, when you've got the business community seeing what the education system is doing to turn out a better product, if you will, from high schools, then they're more apt to be engaged. On the back end, you know, I just recently told Wendy that I was told a couple of weeks ago that they're not going to continue the program, and at least in the high schools that I was teaching, the challenge being is that school systems can be very, shall we say, bling chasers. So they're chasing the next shiny object. And so 2 years ago, we introduced an incubator program into the same high schools, and that became the new shiny object for the business community / school system collaboration. And the liaison that was responsible for keeping the Rising Stars program active followed that shiny object so much, combined with the fact that I think she was more interested in finding a new job, which she did, but didn't pay much attention to the program. So it was never leveraged as Rick's program. It was always leveraged as the school's program. And so consequently, I didn't spend a whole lot of time marketing it on the front end or the back end, except for when I was needed. So I think the lesson learned is collaborate on the front end, and don't forget to, you know, stay plugged in, even though it may not be your program. Make sure you stay plugged in, as Roger has alluded to as well. But, you know, just something to be aware of.
Yeah, I guess the two principles that would come to my mind whenever you're working with education, my career was in education, and there's some distinct differences between how education works and how the business community works. And so the two principles that I would put out there is be patient. I think I told you that I started the conversation and it didn't pick up again until 6 months later. And I actually had given up on it. So be patient, because, and maybe be persistent. You know, check back with them a lot if you are making inquiries with educational institutions. And then the other one is be flexible, because again, they're not as they take a lot longer to make decisions in education, and they can change their mind very quickly. And so just be ready for change. I mean, there were a lot of changes, location changes, things that kind of caught me by surprise. But just don't be surprised when there are a lot of changes.
All right.
That's great. Thank you.
Any final thoughts or questions? All right, then I'd like to thank both Rick and Roger for taking some time to share their wisdom with us today. And I wish you all a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.